All right, welcome back. So now we're going to talk about what I call rules for a good argument. We make arguments on all kinds of topics. People, when they make an argument, are trying to make a point. They're trying to give support or proof for a conclusion that they're trying to make. So an argument is just ideas intended to support a conclusion. Some arguments are good and some are not. Um, what I'm going to talk to you about today are rules for a good argument so that you can use these rules when deciding if somebody else's argument is good. You can also use these rules to help you as you're creating your own arguments. And obviously, you'll want your argument to conform to the rules for a good argument. There are two rules. And the first rule is that all of the premises are reasonable for you to believe. A premise is an assumption or a reason that's in an argument. The second rule is that the argument has a pattern such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Or more simply, I'll say the argument is valid. So we're going to start off with practice here. The arguments that we're going to look at today in this video are going to be simple, just so that you learn about the rules. After this video, we'll be looking at arguments that are much more interesting about topics like, does God exist? All right, so let's start off with this argument here. And this is actually kind of what I see from the chair I'm in here. I've got my dog in his dog bed, and every now and then in my videos, you might hear him barking. But let's look at this argument. You see, it's a three-step argument. Number one and number two are the premises. Number three is the conclusion. Anytime I give you an argument in this class, it's always going to be really obvious what the conclusion is. It's going to have therefore in front of it. So this argument, the first premise is saying if Scott's dog is barking, then Scott is grumpy. Number two, Scott's dog is barking. Number three, therefore, Scott is grumpy. Okay, so we're going to start off thinking about rule two. So go back to rule two. Rule two requires that the argument be set up so that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So look at this 1, 2, 3 argument. Take a moment. I'm going to give you a moment to decide if you think this argument obeys rule two. So if 1 and 2 are true, does 3 have to be true? And I'll pause for a moment and let you think about that, and then I'll give you the answer. All right. So the answer is that yes, the argument is valid. And so let's think about premise one. So what premise one is saying is whenever the dog is barking, I'm grumpy. If we then find out in premise two that the dog is barking, it must be the case that I'm grumpy. So if we go along with premise one and premise two, if we pretend that 1 and 2 are true, 3 has to be true. So it obeys rule two. Now, what about rule one, that all the premises are reasonable for you to believe? All right, well, let's look at premise one. Premise one says if Scott's dog is barking, then Scott's grumpy. Well, we can actually think of situations where number one is not true. We can imagine times where the dog is barking, but Scott's not grumpy. What if the dog's barking and it's because there's an intruder at the door? Then I would say, good dog, good job barking. Or if the dog was barking happy barks, which he does sometimes when somebody comes home, he's very happy. Um, he mainly barks when people leave or when somebody tries to deliver something. He actually bit a package today. Um, that did make me grumpy. But if he is barking to protect or to communicate in a time where that's like appropriate, then I'm not going to be grumpy. So, this argument, the first premise is not reasonable because we can imagine times where the dog is barking and I'm not grumpy. Maybe he's barking at an intruder, or he could be barking and I'm not even home and I don't hear him. So, for this argument, we would say it's valid but not good because premise one is not reasonable. Premise one's not reasonable because we can think of times where the if part is true and the then part is not. All right, next argument. If Scott's dog is barking, Scott is grumpy. Okay, so that's the same first premise. Next, Scott is grumpy, therefore Scott's dog is barking. So I'm going to ask you to think about whether or not this is valid. Again, and again, back to rule 2. I'm asking you, if the premises are true, does the conclusion have to be true? All right, take a moment to think about that, and then I'll give you the answer. Okay, so this argument is invalid, and the reason is that we can imagine situations where 1 and 2 are true, but 3 is not. Remember, for an argument to be valid, it means if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So we can imagine that I'm weird that way. Whenever the dog's barking, I'm grumpy. We can imagine that I'm grumpy, but it doesn't have to be the case that the dog is barking. I could be grumpy for some other reason. If my back is sore, which it's been for a couple days, after a while, that can make you grumpy by the end of the day. So I might be grumpy because I have a sore back, not because my dog is barking. So this argument is invalid because just because the premises are true doesn't mean the conclusion has to be true. And remember, the argument, in order for an argument to be good, it has to obey both rules. This one disobeys rule 2. So we would just say for this one, not good. So this is not a good argument. We don't even have to talk about whether the premises are reasonable or not. Next, practice argument, same first premise. I just added a not in front of 2 and 3. Take a moment to think about whether or not this argument is valid, and then I'll give you the answer. So this is a valid argument, and it's kind of hard to figure it out, and soon I'll give you a shortcut that'll make it easier. But this argument's valid because of the power of premise 1. It's basically saying whenever the dog's barking, I'm grumpy. So the dog's barking is like guaranteeing that I'm grumpy. So there's never really going to be a situation where the dog's barking and I'm not grumpy. So then if we find out in premise 2 that I'm not grumpy, then there's no way that the dog is barking. So this one ends up being valid. Now, back to rule 1, are the premises reasonable for you to believe? Well, here, the first premise is the same. So we'd have to say, but not good, because premise 1 is not reasonable. Why isn't premise 1 reasonable? Because, again, the dog could be barking, but I'm not grumpy. Maybe the dog's barking and it's my birthday and nothing's going to make me grumpy on my birthday. All right, so now I'm going to talk to you about a shortcut for determining if an argument is good. Basically, what you do is and I should say this is a shortcut really just for rule 2. For this one, you focus on the pattern of the arguments. I haven't really been talking about that much now, up to now, but now I'm going to talk about patterns. So a shortcut for seeing if an argument is valid is to break it down into a pattern. And we'll go back to our first argument. What you do is you look for words that are repeated and you assign them a letter. So in here, you'll see Scott's dog is barking is repeated. I'm going to call that P. Scott is grumpy is repeated. I'm going to call that Q. Now, you don't have to use P's and Q's. You could use A's and B's or X's and Y's, symbols. It doesn't really matter. The point is just to be consistent with it. So Scott's dog is barking. I'm going to say we labeled that already P. Scott's grumpy is going to be Q. So now we see the overall pattern for this argument is if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Now the thing with patterns is that they can be repeated. So we can see other arguments that follow the same pattern. So here's one. It's also following the same if P, then Q, P, therefore Q pattern. So we got Scott's at home is P. He's in Raleigh is Q. Scott's at home again. There's our P. Scott's in Raleigh. There's our Q. So this follows the same pattern. Now, just even before we look at the pattern, we can see that this argument is valid. If the first two premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So if it's true that whenever I'm at home, I'm in Raleigh, and if it's true that I'm at home, it must be the case that I'm in Raleigh. So we know even without looking at the pattern that this argument is valid. And so what happens is when you look at a few arguments following this if P, then Q, P, therefore Q pattern, you'll notice a conclusion that you can draw, which is that any argument with this pattern is valid. If it's Saturday, then Scott's having a great day. It's Saturday, therefore Scott's having a great day. It's going to be valid every time. So let's look at the pattern for the other argument we looked at. You'll see, I'll just jump to it. This one was invalid, and it follows this pattern, right? That Scott's grumpy is going to be the Q. Scott's dog is barking is the P. And we said that this argument is invalid. We can see other arguments like this that are also invalid. And this one may be easier to see than the previous one because it's about location. Location's a little more concrete. Grumpiness is more mental, but we can see here that even without looking at the pattern, this one's going to be invalid. Whenever I'm at home, I'm in Raleigh, therefore I'm at home. Nope. I could be in some other part of Raleigh. I could be in my office at peace and not at home. So we would say this argument is invalid, even without looking at the pattern. But what we can see by looking at this invalid argument and looking at the other invalid argument is we can draw an inference that any argument with this pattern is going to be invalid. And then the last one we looked at was one with some knots in it. So for this one, the way I symbolize it, put it into a pattern, it's if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. And we'll see that this one is in the same pattern. And this one is also valid. Whenever I'm at home, I'm in Raleigh. I'm not in Raleigh. Therefore, I'm not at home. That one is also valid. And it follows the same pattern of if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. And so again, what we see is that any argument with this pattern is valid. So we've now seen two arguments that have a valid pattern, one that has an invalid pattern. There are actually an infinite number of patterns an argument could follow. But what I would suggest is when you're using the rules for a good argument, you're trying to figure out if an argument is valid, that you break it down into a pattern. A benefit of putting an argument into a pattern, like we did here, is that even if you don't know what the words mean, you can still figure out if it's valid. And this is especially helpful when people are talking about topics that you're not really an expert in. Maybe people are talking about religion or politics, and maybe you don't follow that much. And so there might be words that they're using that you're not understanding, but you can still notice the pattern of their words, and you can you can look at the pattern and ask yourself if it's a valid pattern or not. If it is a valid pattern and you're trying to evaluate what they're saying, then you would need to think about whether or not the premises are reasonable. And again, the way you evaluate premises for being reasonable is you just look at all the evidence you have available to you, all the information you have available to you. So, in short, when you're looking to see if an argument is valid, you pretend that the premises are true and focus on the logic of the argument. For rule 1, you're not pretending that the premises are true. You are, let's say, yeah, people still talk like this. You get real. So you're going to get real about whether or not the premises make sense or not. So when somebody says get real, they're basically saying use your common sense. So when you're using rule 1 to see if a premise is reasonable or not, get real. Ask yourself if the premises really do make sense. All right, so what's going to happen after today is we're going to look at arguments that are on different, more interesting topics. And as we go, we'll be asking ourselves if the argument is good or not. For each of the arguments we go over in this class, I want you to be asking yourself, is this a good argument? Is it valid? Are the premises reasonable? What I'm going to do as the teacher is when I give you an argument in the slides, I'm going to try as best I can to make it valid. So I will try to make it valid so that our focus will be on whether or not the premises are reasonable for you to believe. Later, there will be an assignment where you will create your own argument. When you create your own argument, I'm going to suggest that you put it in this simpler pattern, the if P then Q, P therefore Q pattern. And that way, when you explain it, you just have to focus on whether or not the premises are reasonable for you to believe. Okay, I think that's all for now. Let me know if you have any questions after you've watched this video. Thanks for taking the time. Bye-bye.